Well, welcome back to Media Law, and the second half of this module we're looking at anti-terrorism and hate laws. And these are two areas that are quite commonly mentioned in the media today. Unfortunately, we live in a society and a world which is not particularly safe because of terrorism activities being conducted by various parties throughout the globe. This isn't a new phenomenon. Over many centuries there have been terrorist activities. In fact, during the 20th century, a lot of media coverage, particularly in the UK, was around what was then called the Irish Republican Army and its bombings in London and other parts of the UK, and that prompted anti-terror laws in that country. As is often said, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and that was certainly the Sri Lankan Tamils' approach to their activities that were called terrorist activities by the Sri Lankan government. And so Sri Lanka had its own ethnic and civil terrorism wars going on through most of the 20th century and into the 21st. And in recent decades, since 9/11, what we've had throughout the world are terrorism acts conducted by people purporting to be doing this in the name of the religion Islam, although the vast majority of Muslims in the world disavow of such activities done in the name of their religion. So there's a global context to anti-terrorism, but that particular event, 9/11 in September 2001 in the United States, the terrorist attack on that country triggered a whole series of new national security and anti-terrorism laws throughout the world, and Australia is no exception to that. In the US, it triggered a big piece of legislation called the Patriot Act, and other countries modelled a lot of their legislation on the same kinds of restrictions that appeared in that. Now, many of the national security and anti-terror laws do not have much to do with the media. They control people who can go close to airports, for example. They give certain powers to customs officials, and they introduce certain protocols for getting pilots' licenses and that kind of thing. So they don't necessarily relate to journalism. And certainly those that were in existence prior to 9/11 were more of that ilk. But since 9/11, since 2001, Australia has introduced more than 60 anti-terror laws, and many of these have special relevance to the media and its operations. Now, we heard about that area of confidentiality and secrecy in our last module, and this links somewhat with the anti-terrorism and national security laws, because many of these laws have given the government agencies that are meant to be policing national security, intelligence agencies, federal and state police bodies, these sorts of bodies, these sorts of agencies, it's given them new surveillance powers and powers to be able to access people's communications, and this in turn has jeopardized journalists' confidence that the confidentiality of their sources will be kept sacred, and that the authorities may well find out who their whistleblowers are. Now, the worry is that with the reach that occurs with these new powers being given to these federal and state agencies, that these might be misused in some way. And while everybody agrees that such powers are needed to stop a terrible act of atrocity against our citizens, we all agree with that, but what we disagree over is the level to which such powers should be able to impinge upon free expression and media freedoms, and to the extent to which they might be misused in other contexts where they're not required for national security purposes, but are used in other ways to monitor, say, dissidents or others in society who may have nothing to do with terrorism. Now, the key laws in Australia that have been passed over the past decade and more have been to do with the extension of powers for the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, the introduction of new special intelligence operation laws, where it's a jailable offence for journalists or anyone else to publish the details of a special intelligence operation, and the problem is finding out whether there is one. New laws that require the major telcos to retain their metadata, the important basic computer information about all citizens' communication on their devices. And they have to retain that for at least 2 years, and for that to be accessible to the authorities. Now, journalists do have some exemptions to that retention, but unfortunately the procedures for the journalist exemption and the review of whether a journalist's metadata might be accessed, unfortunately all of that happens in a secret, closed operation, and we will never be privy to what goes on there under that legislation. And the courts also have new powers of suppression of information and proceedings in anti-terrorism and national security cases. So what all of this means is that on the one hand, the agencies certainly have more powers to be able to intervene and to stop terrorist acts, but the question is whether they have too much of that power and are impinging upon media freedoms and introducing surveillance of journalists and their activities, and perhaps jeopardising journalists' sources and whistleblowers. So I haven't gone into a lot of detail. Please read the textbook there. But in this area, even since the most recent edition of the textbook, the law has changed. So go to my blog and have a read of some of the more recent changes in the law to update you on that. The other big area of this chapter deals with race hate and the ethics and law of racial discrimination and hateful speech. And there are international instruments controlling this, and even international laws covering race hate. In Australia, we have various discrimination and race hate laws. Some are called racial vilification laws, others are racial discrimination laws. The Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act has been subject to quite a degree of controversy over recent years, and it may well change in the near future. It could change on a number of occasions depending on the political will and the machinations of federal parliament. So I won't say a whole lot about the Racial Discrimination Act, but the key section that is always up for debate is section 18C. And there is a body of case law around section 18C that is mentioned in the textbook, and that is to do with whether a publication that you have made is discriminatory against a racial group in society. Now, the law has been that it is, if your material is found offensive to that particular race, that's the part of it that is debated as to whether this mere offence to another race is enough, and how difficult that is to prove, and what defences should be available. So have a look at that, but also watch carefully the development of the reform of that area. There are also many ethical and self-regulatory approaches to race and race hate, and almost every code of ethics has racial discrimination elements to it, and almost all of the self-regulatory bodies, like the Australian Press Council and the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, which controls the journalists' code of ethics, have disciplinary proceedings in place where they can field complaints about particularly racist or offensive behaviour and or publications, and review that and perhaps issue some adjudication in that regard. At state level, there are several different discrimination and racial vilification acts. An important point is that sometimes these are centred upon race, but other times they embrace other types of discrimination. And a very important area of debate is whether racial discrimination includes discrimination against religions. At a Commonwealth level, it's generally accepted that it's only to do with race and not religion, but that's prompted important decisions. For example, the interpretation of Judaism as being Jewish as a race, subject to several decisions in the racial discrimination, under the Racial Discrimination Act in the federal courts, whereas being Muslim is a religion, because so many different races of people adopt Islam as their religion. So that's something that you might wish to debate on the discussion boards or in your tutorials. Don't forget to follow your study plan very closely, starting of course with this mini lecture, which has just touched upon some of the main points in this topic area. Go deeper into the textbook and listen to the full lecture for much more detail, and engage in those discussion boards and activities. We'll see you next time.